The candles in the Ashcroft ballroom numbered 400, and every one of them was wasted on the Duke. He stood at the edge of the room with his shoulders set against the pilaster, and his face arranged in the expression his valet had once called civility under protest. The orchestra played. The dancers turned. Miss Cecilia Graves, the Earl of Sefton's youngest daughter, occupied the center of the floor in a gown the color of champagne foam, and the Dowager Duchess of Ashcroft watched from her gilt chair with the satisfaction of a woman whose plans were proceeding exactly as designed. It was the Midsummer Ball of 1814, and the Duke of Ashcroft was 31 years old, and he had not enjoyed a conversation in this house since the previous autumn, when his solicitor had brought him news of a drainage project in the lower fields that had, for 11 minutes, required his full attention. Across the room, near the doors that opened onto the south terrace, Lady Penhurst's companion stood in a dress of plain white muslin, with her hands folded and her chin slightly raised, watching the crowd the way a naturalist might watch a colony of unfamiliar birds. She was not dancing. She had not been asked. The Dowager had noticed her once, early in the evening, and had turned to Lady Penhurst with a smile that did not reach her jaw. "You have brought your companion, I see," she had said, the word landing like a coin placed on a counter. "How kind of you to let the girl have the evening." Lady Penhurst had murmured something about fresh air, and the matter had been settled, and Marjorie Ashworth had understood, as she had understood every evening for the past 11 months, that she was furniture that breathed. She did not see the Duke leave the ballroom. She did not see him cross the long gallery with his hands clasped behind his back and his stride quickening the farther he moved from the music. She had already been in the library for 6 minutes when the door opened, and the man who entered did not knock, because one does not knock on the doors of one's own house, and one does not expect to find a woman in a white muslin dress sitting in the window seat with a small leather volume balanced on her drawn-up knee. He stopped. She looked up. The book was open to a page dense with pencil marks in a hand that was not the printer's. "You are in my library," he said. "You are in my light," she said, and then seemed to hear herself, and the color rose in her face so quickly that it reached her temples before she could lower her gaze. He did not leave. He looked at the book. The binding was cracked, and the pages were foxed, and the marginalia ran in a slanted hand up the outer edges and into the gutters. "Cowper," he said. She nodded. "The Castaway." He knew the poem. Everyone of his generation knew the poem. The sailor swept over in the storm, the ship sailing on, the drowning man watching the lanterns recede. It was a poem about resignation, about the futility of struggling against what the sea had already decided. He had read it at 15 and understood it perfectly, and he had not thought about it since. "You have written all over it," he said. "My father wrote all over it," she said. "He believed Cowper was wrong." The Duke looked at her. No one at his own ball had said anything that surprised him in 4 years of hosting them. "Wrong about what?" he said. "About the swimming," she said. Her voice was low, and her chin was steady, and her hands had tightened on the book so that her knuckles pressed white against the leather. "The sailor does not stop swimming. That is the point your father missed, I think, and that Cowper made." "No," she said. "Cowper made the point that the sailor swam, that he kept swimming when the ship was gone and the storm was high and no one was coming. The poem is not about resignation. It is about the refusal to stop." He opened his mouth and then closed it. The candle on the reading desk guttered in the draught from the terrace doors and threw her shadow long across the carpet. And for a moment, the room held only the sound of the orchestra bleeding faintly through the walls and the particular quality of silence that fills a space when someone has said something that a man of considerable education and rank and pride cannot immediately answer. She stood. She closed the book. She left the library without excusing herself, because one does not excuse oneself from a room that does not belong to one. And the Duke of Ashcroft remained where he was for a long time, his hand resting on the back of the chair she had vacated, his face unreadable. If that moment stirred something in you, if you felt the particular electricity of a woman who refuses to be small in a room that has no space for her, you might consider staying. The story has not yet begun. Marjorie Ashworth had been a clergyman's daughter in the village of Hartwell until 18 months before that evening, when the Reverend James Ashworth had died in his study, with a half-finished sermon on his desk and debts of £400 in his name. The debts were modest by the standards of the season, catastrophic by the standards of a woman with no brother, no inheritance, and no prospect beyond the goodwill of distant relations. Lady Penhurst was her mother's cousin, twice removed, and had offered the position of companion with the particular generosity of a woman who needed someone to read aloud in the evenings and did not wish to pay more than £30 a year for the service. Marjorie had accepted because there was nothing else to accept. She had packed her father's books into a single trunk, sold the rest of the household, applied £6 against the debt, and arrived at Penhurst House in November with her hands already roughened from the work of closing a life. The leather volume of verse was the only book she had kept for herself. Her father had annotated it across 30 years, arguing with the poets in pencil the way he argued with his bishop in letters, and the marginalia had become, in the months since his death, the only conversation she could still have with him. She read it at night by a single candle in the room above the kitchen that Lady Penhurst called her chamber, and the housekeeper called the old linen closet. She did not complain. She did not weep where anyone could hear. She performed her duties with a precision that was, to the household, invisible, because competence in a companion is expected, the way heat in a fire is expected, noticed only when it fails. The dowager had her own plans, and they did not concern Marjorie Ashworth. Helena Hale, Dowager Duchess of Ashcroft, had spent the 3 years since her husband's death refining a single ambition with the discipline of a military campaign. Her son would marry well. Her son would marry Cecilia Graves, whose father controlled 3 boroughs and whose mother had been a Cavendish, and the match would restore the political weight the dukedom had lost when the old duke's final years had been consumed by illness and by grief over their younger son. The dowager did not speak of Thomas. Nobody in the house spoke of Thomas. The portrait of a boy with dark hair and an open smile had been turned to the wall in the long gallery 18 months before Marjorie arrived, and the servants had learned not to dust the frame. On the evening after the ball, in her private sitting room, the dowager had poured tea for Cecilia and her mother, and had mentioned, in a voice calibrated to sound merely observational, that Lady Penhurst had brought her little companion to the ball. "The girl stood by the doors all evening," the dowager said. "I suppose she had nowhere else to go. One does feel for them, the companions, always at the edge of someone else's life." The word settled into the room like a verdict. Cecilia had smiled, and the matter had been filed away, and across the park, in the linen closet above the kitchen, Marjorie Ashworth turned a page of her father's book and did not know that she had been categorized. The second occasion came 4 days later, and it came because Lady Penhurst's maid, a girl of 19 named Ellen, had taken a fever that kept her in the servants' quarters with a compress on her forehead and a rattle in her chest. Lady Penhurst had gone to the village for the apothecary. The housekeeper, Mrs. Blythe, had changed the compress twice and left a broth that Ellen could not lift to drink. Marjorie had not been asked. She had simply gone. She sat on the edge of the narrow cot in the attic room, where the summer heat pressed close, and the window would not open beyond a hand's width, and she read. She read from a volume of children's verse that she had found on the shelf in the nursery, where the books were old and smelled of dust and someone's childhood. And her voice was steady and low, and she did not pause when Ellen's breathing caught, or when the compress slid to the floor, and she replaced it without stopping the line. She read for an hour. She adjusted the pillow behind Ellen's head without pausing the verse. She wiped the girl's temples with a cloth she had dampened at the basin, and the water left a thin line across Ellen's forehead that caught the light from the narrow window and shone like a thread of silver. She read until Ellen's breathing slowed and steadied, and the rattle in her chest subsided to something that sounded less like drowning and more like sleep. And when the girl's hand unclenched on the coverlet, Marjorie placed her own hand over it and held it there, warm against warm, until the fingers went slack. She did not know that the Duke of Ashcroft had come to Penhurst House to return a borrowed map of the county boundaries his steward had requested, and she did not know that Mrs. Blythe had directed him to the main parlor and that he had taken the wrong stair, and she did not know that he stood in the doorway of the attic room for the space of 9 lines of verse, watching a woman in a gray dress read a sick girl to sleep with the patience of someone who understood that comfort is not a performance. He left before she looked up. He descended the stair with a stillness in his face that Mrs. Blythe, who had served his family for 22 years, had not seen since the morning after the funeral. In the stable yard, he paused. "Has Miss Ashworth eaten today?" he asked, and the question was so unexpected that the groom looked to Mrs. Blythe, and Mrs. Blythe looked at the Duke, and neither could answer. "See that she does," he said. It was a command. It sounded like indifference. Mrs. Blythe, who was not a fool, heard something else entirely, and she set a tray outside Marjorie's door that evening with a slice of cold pie, and a note that said only from the kitchen, "With our thanks," and Marjorie ate it in her linen closet, and did not understand why her hands were shaking. The Dowager's dinner was held 2 weeks before Michaelmas, and it gathered 18 guests around a table laid with the Ashcroft silver and banked with white roses that cost more than Marjorie's quarterly wage. Lady Penhurst had been invited because she was a neighbor. Marjorie attended because Lady Penhurst could not manage the carriage steps alone and required a steadying hand and someone to carry the shawl and someone to sit at the far end of the table where the candles were fewer and the conversation was not expected to be interesting. The Dowager had placed Marjorie between the rector and the rector's wife, a location from which the silver, the roses, and Miss Cecilia Graves were all visible at optimum advantage. Cecilia wore a gown of pale gold silk with a string of pearls that caught the light each time she turned her head, and she turned her head often, because the Duke sat at the head of the table, and his attention was the evening's real currency. Marjorie wore the gray dress. She wore the gray dress because she owned the gray dress and the white muslin and nothing else, and because a companion does not dress for dinner, a companion dresses for absence. The fabric was good wool, well made, but the cuffs were beginning to fray at the seams where her wrists met the table edge each time she poured Lady Penhurst's morning tea, and the hem had been let down once already and could not be let down again. Against the pale gold and cream and oyster silk of the other women at the table, the gray dress did what it had always done. It rendered her approximate. It placed her in the category of things the eye passes over on its way to something brighter. The Duke did not look at her when she entered. He looked at her when she spoke. It happened during the second course, when the rector mentioned a poem he had heard recited at a literary evening in Bath, and Marjorie, who had been addressed directly for the first time all evening, answered with a correction so precise and so quietly delivered that the rector blinked and the rector's wife set down her fork, and the table fell silent for 3 seconds that felt like 30. The Duke's hand, which had been reaching for his glass, stopped. Marjorie saw the stillness and misread it as displeasure, because she had been trained by 11 months of invisibility to read every silence as a judgment against her. And she lowered her gaze and said nothing more for the rest of the course. He looked away. His jaw tightened. 2 seats down, the Dowager observed the exchange with the diagnostic attention of a woman who has spent her life reading rooms, and she did not like what she read. "Lady Penhurst," the Dowager said, her voice carrying the length of the table with practiced ease, "your companion seems very well informed. One wonders where a clergyman's daughter finds so many opinions." The table heard it. Marjorie heard it. The rector's wife heard it, and glanced sideways with the quick, sympathetic wince of a woman who recognizes the sound of a door being closed. The word companion fell again, heavier this time, in front of witnesses whose names filled the county register, and Marjorie's hand in her lap tightened around the napkin until the linen creased. Across the table, the Duke set down his glass. He did not speak. He looked at Marjorie with an expression she could not read, something held and careful behind his eyes, and then he turned to the rector and asked a question about the drainage of the lower fields. And the conversation moved on, and Marjorie exhaled, and the evening continued as if nothing had happened. And nothing had happened, except that Sebastian Hale had made a decision he did not yet know he had made. The days after the dinner accumulated like pages turned in a book, whose plot the reader consents before the characters can. The Duke called at Penhurst House twice in the following week, once to discuss estate boundaries with Lady Penhurst, and once to return a pamphlet on crop rotation that no one had lent him. On the first visit, he found Marjorie in the garden, cutting lavender for the sick room, and told her to wear a hat in the sun. On the second visit, he found her in the parlor, mending Lady Penhurst's hem, and asked her, in a voice that did not invite debate, whether she had eaten that day. She had not. He sent a footman with bread and cold chicken from the Ashcroft kitchen within the hour, and Marjorie ate it standing in the garden because she could not sit down without crying, and she did not understand why a man who spoke to her as if she were a wayward tenant made her feel as if someone had placed a hand over the place where the cold lived. She was afraid of what his attention meant. She was more afraid of what its absence would mean when it inevitably came. If you have ever stood at the edge of warmth that you knew was not meant for you, if you have ever held your hands toward a fire in someone else's house and felt both the heat and the distance at once, then you understand what Marjorie Ashworth carried in her chest through those September weeks, and you understand why she could not name it. He had not always been cold. There had been a time, before the summer of 1811, when Sebastian Hale had been capable of laughter and carelessness and the particular recklessness of a young man who believed that his own good fortune was a condition of the atmosphere rather than a temporary loan. Thomas had been 22 that summer. Sebastian had arranged the sailing party himself, a day on the water off the Devon coast with friends and wine and the kind of sunlight that makes everything seem permanent. The squall came from the southwest with no warning anyone could later agree on. The boat held. Thomas did not. He went over the rail reaching for a line that had come loose, and the water took him under in the time it took Sebastian to cross the deck. And when they pulled him out 40 minutes later, his brother's face was already the color of rain. Sebastian had carried the body up the shingle himself. He had not put it down when the others offered to help. He had walked the quarter-mile to the inn with Thomas in his arms, and his shoes filling with water at each step. And when the surgeon came, he had said the words the Duke already knew, and the world had reorganized itself around the absence, and Sebastian had rebuilt himself as a man made of procedure and discipline and silence, because the alternative was a grief so large it would consume the estate, the tenants, the dukedom, and every room he walked through for the rest of his life. He kept a single page in his breast pocket, Thomas had copied out 8 lines of Cowper's verse as a schoolboy, in a hand that slanted to the right, and the page had been found in his coat after the drowning, and Sebastian had carried it against his chest for 3 years without showing it to anyone, because the page was the last thing his brother's hand had touched that was not seawater, and because the poem was about a man who drowned, and because Sebastian had arranged the outing, and because the guilt was a stone he had swallowed that would not dissolve. His mother did not speak of Thomas, because the dowager's grief expressed itself as architecture, the portrait turned, the name unspoken, the room sealed, the future redirected toward Cecilia Graves, and the restoration of the family's position, as if position could fill the space a boy had left. Sebastian did not speak of Thomas, because speaking would mean the stone in his throat might move, and he was not certain what would happen if it did. Marjorie Ashworth had argued with him about a poem about a drowning man, and she had said the poem was not about resignation, and she had said it was about the refusal to stop swimming. And her father's pencil marks ran through the margins like the hand of a man who refused to let the text have the final word. And Sebastian had stood in his own library after she left and pressed his hand against the page in his breast pocket, and felt, for the first time in 3 years, something crack. The morning of the Michaelmas assembly arrived with a frost that silvered the hedgerows and turned the park into a landscape rendered in pewter and white. The dowager had spent the preceding week in a state of focused preparation that the household recognized as the final stage of her campaign. Cecilia would wear the cream silk. The rector would announce the engagement from the parish register the following Sunday. The Duke had not proposed, technically, in any language a solicitor would recognize, but the dowager had discussed settlements with Cecilia's father and had arranged the seating and had informed Mrs. Blythe that the West Wing would require new linens by Christmas. And in the dowager's understanding of how the world worked, these actions constituted an agreement that only a fool would challenge. The companion would not be present. The dowager had spoken to Lady Penhurst that morning. In the gentle voice she used when delivering instructions she wished to appear as suggestions. "I wonder," the dowager had said, "whether Miss Ashworth might be more comfortable remaining at Penhurst House this evening. The assembly can be overwhelming for someone in her position, and I should hate for the girl to feel out of place." Lady Penhurst, who was old and kind, and frightened of the dowager in the way that small landowners are frightened of large ones, had agreed. Marjorie learned of it at noon, when Lady Penhurst told her, with genuine apology in her voice, that she would attend the assembly with Mrs. Blythe's assistance instead. The dowager felt it would be more appropriate, Lady Penhurst said, and the word appropriate landed where the word companion had landed before it, in the same bruised place below Marjorie's sternum, where all the season's small cruelties had accumulated into a weight she carried as steadily and as invisibly as the tray of tea she brought each morning. Marjorie nodded. She climbed the stair to the linen closet and sat on the edge of the cot and opened her father's book to the page where his marginalia was thickest, and she read his handwriting until the words blurred, and she did not cry, because she had learned in 11 months that crying is a luxury that requires privacy, and privacy is something a companion does not own. An hour later, Mrs. Blythe found her in the kitchen garden, pulling spent stalks from the herb bed with her bare hands in the frost. The dowager told Lady Graves this morning that the Duke would never look twice at the companion, Mrs. Blythe said, and her voice was careful, and her eyes were not. She said the girl was a distraction that would be tidied away before the season turned. Third voicing. Third setting. A witnessed report delivered in the kitchen garden by a woman who could not bear to let the words pass, without someone who cared hearing them. Marjorie's hands stilled in the soil. The frost had reddened her fingers, and the cold had settled into the joints of her wrists, where the sleeves of the gray dress did not quite reach, and she looked at Mrs. Blythe with an expression that was not anger and was not sorrow, and was something closer to the terrible clarity that arrives when a person finally understands the exact dimensions of the space the world has assigned them. She stood. She washed her hands at the pump. She walked to Ashcroft Hall in her gray dress and her worn shoes with the leather cracking at the heel. And she asked the footman for the Duke. And the footman, who had been given no instructions to prevent it, led her to the study, where Sebastian sat alone with a glass of brandy and the page from his breast pocket unfolded on the desk before him. He looked up. She looked at the page. She recognized the handwriting of a boy, and she recognized the poem. And she understood in a single breath what the page was and what it cost him to have it out where the light could reach it. "Your Grace," she said, "I must tell you something about the poem, and then I will go, and you need not see me again." He did not speak. His hand moved to cover the page, and then stopped, because covering it would be an admission, and he was not yet ready for that. "The sailor swims," she said. "He swims when the ship is gone, and the lantern is out, and the water is black, and there is no one watching. He swims because swimming is what he is, not because it will save him, because stopping would make him someone he does not recognize." She paused. Her voice had not broken. Her hands were steady at her sides, red from the frost, raw from the garden. "Your brother copied those lines because he understood that, and you carry them because you understand it too. And I am going to leave this house now, because I have been told that I am a distraction to be tidied away, and I will not stand in a room where my presence requires an apology." She turned. She walked to the door. She did not look back, because looking back would have cost her the composure she had carried like a plate of glass across 12 months of silence. And the glass was already cracking. And if he said her name, she was not certain she could keep it whole. He did not say her name. She heard the chair move. She heard his breath catch, a sound so small and so specific that it lodged in her memory the way a splinter lodges in skin, felt with every movement afterward. She left. The Michaelmas assembly at Ashcroft Hall filled the long gallery with candles and county families and the particular sound of a community arranging itself by precedence. Cecilia Graves arrived in the cream silk with her mother's diamonds at her throat and her smile calibrated to the occasion. The dowager stood at the gallery's entrance receiving guests with the warmth of a woman who believes the evening's outcome is already written. Lady Penhurst came alone, attended by Mrs. Blythe. And the dowager noted the companion's absence with a nod so slight it might have been a blink. The rector was present. Mr. Thorne, the family solicitor, was present, having been summoned from London for a matter the dowager had described as routine. The evening proceeded. The Duke entered late. He wore black, as he always wore black, and his face carried the expression the household had learned to read as composure, the set jaw, the level gaze, the posture that admitted no interior. He spoke to the rector. He spoke to Mr. Thorne. He did not speak to Cecilia. He did not speak to his mother. The dowager watched him cross the room with the first tremor of something she had not permitted herself to feel in 3 years of careful planning, and the tremor was doubt, and she suppressed it as she suppressed everything that interfered with the architecture of her intentions. The doors to the gallery opened. Marjorie Ashworth stood in the doorway in the white muslin dress, the only good dress, the dress she had worn to the midsummer ball when the Duke had found her in his library arguing about a poem. Mrs. Blythe stood behind her, and Mrs. Blythe's face wore the particular expression of a woman who has made a decision she is prepared to defend. The dowager's smile thinned. "I did not think," the dowager began, and Sebastian turned. He had been standing at the far end of the gallery, near the tall windows where the frost had drawn patterns on the glass that the candlelight turned to gold. And when Marjorie appeared in the doorway, he went still in the way that Mrs. Blythe had described to the kitchen staff as ice over a river, the surface rigid, the current underneath moving faster than anyone standing on the bank could safely guess. He crossed the room. 3 strides, then 4, then 5, and each stride carried the weight of a title and a name, and 300 years of tenants and fields, and portraits in gilded frames, and the crowd parted not because they understood what was happening, but because a duke in motion carries the weight of 3 centuries of deference, and the bodies moved before the minds could catch them. Someone's glass touched a tray. A woman near the windows inhaled sharply and pressed her hand to her collarbone. The orchestra, which had been playing a country dance, faltered for a beat, and then continued, the violinist watching over his instrument with the expression of a man who senses that the music has become irrelevant to whatever is about to happen in the center of the room. He stopped in front of Marjorie. She looked up at him. Her face was pale, and her chin was raised, and her hands were clasped in front of her, the way they had been clasped at the midsummer ball, the knuckles pressed white, the fingers holding on to each other, because there was nothing else in the room to hold. Miss Ashworth will be the next Duchess of Ashcroft. He said it once. He said it into the silence that his crossing of the room had created, and the words fell into that silence the way a stone falls into still water. And the ripples moved outward through the room, past the rector whose mouth opened, past Mr. Thorne whose hand moved to his coat where the documents lived, past Cecilia Graves whose fingers tightened on her mother's arm, past Lady Penhurst whose eyes filled with tears she did not wipe away, past Mrs. Blythe, who nodded once as if confirming something she had known since the evening she set the tray outside the linen closet door. The dowager did not move. For a span of seconds that the room would later remember as longer than they were, Helena Hale stood with her hand on the back of her gilt chair and her face fixed in the expression she had worn to every public occasion for 3 decades, the mask of a woman who understood how the world worked and who worked it accordingly. Then the mask shifted. It did not shatter. The dowager was too disciplined for shattering. It shifted the way a wall shifts when the foundation beneath it moves, a settling so subtle that only someone watching for it would see the crack. Her mouth opened. It closed. She looked at her son, and for one instant, her eyes held something that was not anger and was not calculation. Something closer to the recognition that the architecture she had built to contain her grief had been, all along, a cage she had placed around the living as well as the dead. "Sebastian," she said, and her voice caught on the second syllable, and she did not finish the sentence. "Mr." Thorne stepped forward. He confirmed, in the plain language solicitors prefer, that the Duke's declaration was consistent with the settlement papers he had been asked to prepare the previous week, and that Miss Ashworth's circumstances presented no legal impediment, and that the Duke was, as he had always been, free to choose. The word choose hung in the gallery with the candle smoke and the frost light and the held breath of 40 witnesses who had come expecting an evening of champagne and moderate entertainment and had instead watched a man cross a room and change everything. Marjorie had not spoken. She stood in the doorway in the white muslin dress with her hands still clasped and her face still pale, and when the Duke looked at her, when he looked at her with the expression she had misread as coldness in the library, and as displeasure at the dinner, and as indifference in the garden, she understood at last what it was. It was the face of a man who had watched someone swim. The fire in the small parlor at Ashcroft Hall burned low and steady through the evening, and the frost on the windows caught the light and held it in patterns that shifted each time the log settled. Marjorie sat in the chair by the hearth, with the leather volume open on her knee, and the Duke sat across from her with his legs stretched toward the warmth, and his coat removed and his cravat loosened in the way that a man loosens a cravat, only in a room where he does not need to perform. The page from his breast pocket lay on the table between them, unfolded, the schoolboy's handwriting visible in the firelight, the ink faded to brown, the edges soft from 3 years of being carried against a heartbeat. She had not asked to see it. He had placed it there the way one places a key on a table in front of someone to whom one is giving a house. Thomas copied those lines when he was 14, he said, his voice low. He did not tell me he had read Cowper. He did not tell me a great many things. Marjorie looked at the page. She looked at the handwriting that slanted to the right, the way her father's handwriting slanted to the right, and she thought of 2 men separated by age and station and circumstance, who had both reached for the same poem and held on to it. And she thought of swimming, and she thought of stopping, and she thought of the particular grace of continuing. She reached across the table and placed her hand over his. His fingers closed around hers. They were warm from the fire and steady in a way she had not expected, because she had spent 12 months reading steadiness as coldness and command as distance and silence as absence, and she was only now learning that some silences are not empty, that some silences are the sound a person makes when they are holding something too large for language and too fragile for carelessness. The house was quiet. The servants had gone. Mrs. Blythe had set a tray of tea and cold supper outside the parlor door, and had retreated with the particular discretion of a woman who understood that some evenings belonged to the people inside the room and not to the house around it. In the long gallery, the portrait of Thomas Hale had been turned back to face the room. The dowager had given the order that afternoon, before the assembly, in a voice that was not steady, and the footman who carried it out said later that her hands had been shaking. It was not forgiveness. It was not resolution. It was the first crack in a wall that had been built to keep grief contained and had instead kept it growing, and the crack would widen in the weeks to come. Slowly, the way ice thaws, the way a woman who has spent 3 years refusing to say a name learns to say it again in a room where the sound of it is permitted. Marjorie did not know this yet. She knew only the fire, and the book, and the page on the table, and the hand around hers, and the particular quality of warmth that fills a room when 2 people who have been swimming alone discover that the water is the same. Outside, the frost deepened. The hedgerows turned to silver. The park lay still under a sky so clear that the stars seemed close enough to touch. And inside the small parlor at Ashcroft Hall, the candle on the reading desk burned to its socket, and guttered once and steadied. And the book of verse lay open to the page where a clergyman's pencil had written, in the margin beside the final stanza, he swam because he was a swimmer, and that was enough. Thank you for staying until the end. If Marjorie's quiet refusal to stop swimming moved you, leave a word for her below and come back when the next story calls.